Thank you very much, and good morning. It is an honor to be here in Seoul, my first time in Korea, and I would like to thank the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy and the Korea Smart Grid Association for inviting me to this very distinguished and impressive conference. It is a great honor to be speaking to so many leaders of the smart grid industry, not only in Korea, from all across Asia and all across the world. I am privileged to serve as the chairman of the Brattle Group. We are a consulting firm based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the U.S., but we have 7 offices in Europe and across the U.S., and we focus on economic, financial, and strategy issues in the power industry and in other industries as well: communications, transportation, financial services, and many other industries. It's my privilege to talk with you today about current smart grid developments in the U.S., and in particular take a look at the economic stimulus package that President Obama passed when he first came into office in 2008, which had an element that focused on the smart grid. And we now have some experience with that we can share with you today to take a look at what happened. But in addition to that, I would like to take a little bit of a look around the world at developments in the electric power industry. This is an area that we follow broadly, and also to take a look at current developments in smart grids and microgrids going on right now in the U.S. It's very striking to me that all over the world, the power industry is confronting very similar challenges, even though the differences between power systems and power industries and national government issues are very, very different. All over the world, we see concerns over climate change and the resilience of power systems to severe weather. We have cheaper renewable and distributed energy entering all over the world, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa or in New York City, where we have an office. Smart grid technologies, including storage, demand response, many things we're going to talk about today, they are spreading everywhere. Demand response and dynamic pricing, as you will hear from me, go hand in hand with smart grid at the retail or customer end. Electric transportation is a revolutionary development. And interestingly, for the first time, we are seeing the birth of a global utility industry. I shouldn't say for the first time, but the globalization of the industry has entered a major new phase. I heard the president of Duke Power Company, which is the largest utility in the U.S., say last week that the top 15 or 18 power utilities in the world supply 30% of all of the power in the world today. And that would never have been true when I began in the industry 20 years ago. And even in the U.S., we have seen the number of utilities consolidate from 100 in the 1970s to only 60 today, with more consolidation coming. Oops. There we go. The smart grid is a universal phenomenon in the power industry. Every power system in the world is getting smarter and will continue to get smarter, but the drivers vary a little by industry. even with those common developments and challenges I just mentioned. In the U.S., the main driver that we see is cost reduction, reducing operating costs, avoiding new power plant build-outs. In the EU, environmental concerns have been dominant. In South America, theft reduction and expanding electrification are important. That's also true in Africa, which isn't shown here. And across the Asia Pacific, there are a whole host of drivers. Professor Moon talked quite a lot about the drivers here in Korea, and I enjoyed that very much. Looking around the world, there are a couple of factors that lead to positive smart grid development. High internet penetration, as we have here in Korea, power sales and housing growth going up, particularly power sales. One area we focus on quite a lot at the Brattle Group, working from country to country and even within countries, is the regulatory system and how possible it is to change it and how long it takes. Customer choice is the U.S. word for deregulating retail power sales. Third-party aggregation means individual companies aggregating the demands of many small customers to create, in effect, a wholesale or large bulk power load. And other regulatory changes are important. And you can see also positives, theft reduction benefits, a strong smart grid industry base, as you have here in Korea, and I think we have in the U.S., and stronger carbon policies and stronger renewable policies go hand in hand with smart grid. They aren't identical, but they are natural complements. And if you take a look at my book, which is pictured on the cover of the slides and is available both in Chinese and English, you can see quite a lot of discussion about the interaction between carbon policies, renewables, and smart grid. There are a few negative factors for smart grid as you go around the country. Some of them are just the opposite of the positive factors we talk about, specifically low sales and housing growth, inflexible regulations regarding pricing and services, which is a problem in some parts of the U.S. If it is difficult to make investments in the distribution power grid, then there is hesitation to make smart grid investments. And again, there are parts of the U.S. where this is true. There have been some very big regulatory problems between the power companies and their regulators and the government in parts of the U.S. relating specifically to smart grid investments. And this has created a bit of a cautionary climate. Low internet penetration and low theft reduction benefits are pretty obvious, I think. This is just an illustration of how we can think about and illustrate some of the smart grid growth factors, growth drivers. Along the horizontal line, you see the degree of unbundling in the market structure, or you might say the degree of competition that's been introduced between generators and retailers, with the United States and Europe at the far end and China at the left side of the diagram, which is an integrated industry or a single owner of the industry. But it's very interesting that this relationship is almost inverse to average annual sales growth, with China and India having among the highest sales growth in the world, and the U.S. surprisingly close to the lowest sales growth in the U.S., in the world. And my colleagues and I at the Brattle Group think that the U.S. growth numbers, as well as Europe's, may be exaggerated. The true growth may be even lower than is shown here. Well, that's a little tour of the world, very brief and incomplete, but I hope it was of a little bit of interest to you. Now let's take a closer look at the United States and spend most of our time there. In the U.S., as in, I think, all developed countries, and even in, I think, most others, the smart grid is integral to the emerging technological and organizational structure of the industry. But in the U.S., it's in its own unique way. The power industry in the U.S. has very low sales growth, as I just showed you on the earlier slide. We have a slow but steady shift to low carbon and distributed sources. We do not have a national climate policy, which I think is unfortunate, as I think action is needed to combat global climate change in all countries. But we do have many smaller policies that together are contributing to a shift away from coal-fired power towards renewables and gas-fired power, and it's quite a significant shift. In the U.S., just a few years ago, coal was producing about 50% of our power. It's now moved quite rapidly in the last few years to 40% of the power, and there are no new coal-fired power plants planned in the U.S. at this time. I doubt there will be any new coal-fired power plants built in the U.S. ever again unless carbon capture and sequestration is made much cheaper. And so you have coal declining over time, and also we have nuclear power declining over time. Because of market forces, we are closing down gradually all of our large nuclear plants and not replacing them. Meanwhile, wind, solar, and natural gas are growing, and they are growing to replace what is being left, not so much for the growth in total sales, which is quite slow. In the U.S., we also have very highly evolved power markets. Some of them are for specific states in the United States, and some of them cover very large regions of the country, but they are very advanced spot markets for power. There are also markets for longer-term products, electric capacity, that can be purchased for 3 years or 1 year or sometimes longer periods. Many ancillary services, that is grid management services, such as reserves, have markets. These markets are extremely complex, but they work remarkably well. You can see some reviews of these markets on the Brattle Group's website. We are often brought in to analyze these markets, and they are continually being improved, changed, and often debated. I don't want to suggest that everyone likes every part of every market, because just the opposite is true. Although the markets are working generally well, there are still flaws in them. There are still some very big debates going on, and they differ in the different parts of the country. But we have these markets. They are here to stay, and they give us spot price signals every hour, in most cases every 5 or 10 minutes, so that we have great transparency in the value of power by time of day. We also have problems with aging infrastructure. Many of our distribution systems in large cities in the U.S. are now some as old as 100 years old in the eastern United States. many of them many 40, 50, 60, 70 years old, and that's gas and electric, and there is a big replacement cycle going on. $750 billion of investment in the distribution system between now and 2030. And there's also additional challenges integrating renewable energy as it increases. It's just very similar to the challenges faced in Europe and a few other places. Finally, in the U.S., there is a fair amount of turmoil over the fact that sales growth is so low that the revenue of power sellers is not going up very quickly, but there is quite a lot of investment required. So this means, if you can do the mathematics, that average price must go up. As Professor Moon mentioned in the last talk we just heard, this causes great dissent in the U.S., and the power companies are very worried about the future financial condition of the industry and the ability to make investments. And in particular, as new solar systems are added, there is a particularly strong debate about the price to be paid to solar generators for the power that the solar systems provide, and whether that price should vary by time of day, and also whether that price should equal a retail price or a wholesale price. We can talk more about that in the question and answer period if you would like. The phrase we use for this in the U.S. is net energy metering, or NEM. So I promised we would take a look at the smart grid investment from the stimulus package, which is sometimes abbreviated ARRA. Those are the initials of the law President Obama passed with Congress in 2008 to stimulate the economy during the Great Recession, as we call it. And we invested about $8 billion total in smart grid-related investments. As of March 2012, when those investments were analyzed, we had spent about $3 billion of that $8 billion. The allocation you see here is out of the total $8 billion. Cross-cutting projects, which was about $5 billion, that is a vague name, but almost all of that was for smart meters and advanced metering infrastructure, AMI. So as you can see, that's almost 7 of the $8 billion went for smart meters and AMI. And the reason is that this law required that any project to be funded must begin immediately because the president wanted to stimulate the economy very quickly. Most of the projects that could begin immediately in this area that didn't require a lot of engineering were AMI installations that utilities had already planned, or meter changing operations that were already planned or could be planned quickly, because if you're simply swapping the meters, you can figure out how to do that relatively quickly. The other areas, though, were very interesting and important. There was $500 million spent for electric distribution, which is distribution automation and related projects. About $300 million for electric transmission upgrades. Now, this is not actually constructing new transmission lines. There was a separate part of the stimulus package that paid for some transmission additions, and those are being built now in the U.S. Most transmission in the U.S. is built not with government funding, but by the investor-owned utilities, and they don't have trouble raising capital for building new transmission lines when the regulators approve those lines. So This was all about smart grid and transmission, and in fact, much of this money was spent on phaser management units, PMUs. And the United States went from 166 of these units, which was very little coverage, to now almost 1,000 PMUs across the United States, which gives almost complete coverage. Now, we don't have the algorithms and software and organizational structures in place yet to use all of this PMU information, but we are building those, and as we do that, improving the management of the grid. The other pictures on this show the locations of where the grant money from the government went to, and the only interesting thing to see in that, I don't know if this has a pointer on it, I think not. If you can look, the purple and red and orange are the parts of the country where there was a particularly large amount of activity, and if you know your geography, that's California, Texas, and New York, which obviously are the three largest states, but in addition, they're unique in that their power markets are largely within their state. So you have special regulatory factors that helped encourage the government to fund smart grid stimulus grants in those areas. Here's a little bit more about the investments. The $3 billion spent by the U.S. generated, according to the United States Department of Energy, about $6 billion in economic output. By the way, that $3 billion was half federal money and half contributed by the private utility or smart grid company that received the grant, a matching requirement, half and half. 117 vendors received that funding. The top 20 vendors among them got about one of the $3 billion. The top vendor, which was Itron, I don't know if Itron is here, but congratulations if you are. Itron got $300 million of the $3 billion, 10%. The average grant was $2.5 million. And interestingly, the analysis by the Department of Energy found that somewhere between $400 million and $1.1 billion of this $3 billion ended up offshore, that is, funded offshore technology companies in Korea and the EU and other places. Now, beyond the stimulus, let me just give you an overview of smart grid activity now in the U.S. and then go into a couple of areas in a little more detail. After this very large funding from the government that came through, much more than has ever been funded by the United States government in this area in history, probably 100 times as much. And that was because this was an unusual stimulus funding bill, very large one, passed during a very unusual and unfortunate and still continuing global slowdown. But after that, after this money came, there has been a slowdown in smart grid investment in the U.S., but by no means has it stopped. As you saw, much of the funding in the stimulus package was for AMI and smart meter systems, and that part of the activity is still funded by the remaining stimulus grants, and smart meters are continuing to go in. But new meter change-out programs are much less common, and instead, most utilities are investing in distribution automation, voltage correction, They're investing in distribution upgrades to accommodate electric vehicles and greater penetration of solar systems. And lots of other distribution automation, smart substations, better monitoring equipment on their distribution systems, outage management systems, things of that nature. As the smart meters go in, there is more dynamic pricing, meaning time-varying prices charged to customers occurring very slowly. It is very unpopular with customers in the U.S. to change electricity prices during each day, pay more for your electricity during the peak hours of the day, but that, as all of you know, it costs much more to produce and deliver power during those periods. And smart meters allow you to do dynamic pricing. It is starting to increase after a long delay in much of the country. In California, for example, it will become the normal means of pricing electricity, and if you don't want it, you will have to opt out or choose not to take prices on that basis, which will take a little bit of work, and most people, we think, will finally accept it after a long period of struggle. I'm going to talk a lot about microgrids in a moment. They are a very hot topic. And as I mentioned, the growth in renewable energy, in particular wind and solar energy, is causing challenges to the management of the grid, as in Europe, and this is forcing quite a lot of investment in better forecasting technology and better power plant and overall grid control technology, which in my opinion is certainly smart grid. Now I mentioned the importance of outage reductions from smart grids. There are some studies of the U.S. power grid that show that even without severe weather events, the U.S. grid is getting less reliable. Professor Masoud Amin of the University of Minnesota has very good data on U.S. reliability. And while there is some debate over how rapidly the trend is going up, I think it is going up a little bit, and that's because the infrastructure is getting older, and also the U.S. is extending its cities and its suburbs into areas where it is harder to maintain a reliable distribution system. As you can see, the outages in the U.S. are much higher on average, the minutes of outage, than in the best countries, Japan and Korea being two of them. 214 average minutes of outage in the U.S. Northeast, which is the worst section of the country. That's New York and that area with the oldest grid and the densest grid, compared to 4 minutes average annual outage in Japan. And of course, this is costly to us. Even short outages, as you know, are very costly to businesses that use digital equipment and must reset it. Right? And in these areas, again, even in normal weather, the smart grid is demonstrating its value in the U.S., and customers and regulators are starting to understand this. There's and one of my favorite examples of this is a amusement park, or sometimes called a theme park, called Silver Dollar City, which is based on the western United States. It's located in Missouri, a very large theme park with roller coaster rides and boat rides and Ferris wheels and lots of electrically driven amusement rides, and many other items. It's one of the biggest entertainment districts in the United States. And it has as many as 40,000 people in it on a Friday or a Saturday night inside this entertainment district. The electric company that serves this area realized that if there were outages when the area was filled with people, they would have to for safety reasons, they would have to evacuate 40,000 people, and some of the evacuations would have to be from these amusement rides, which are really quite dangerous when they stop and you have to get people off the Ferris wheels and roller coasters. So they put in a distribution loop into this theme park with automatic rerouters and reclosers. And I met the president of this utility who told me about the very first night that they had an outage when they had 40,000 people in the park, and they were watching the computer to see whether the system would work and restore power and prevent an evacuation. And it took about 2 or 3 seconds for the system to recompute and rearrange and reclose the circuits, but it worked, and it saved them a very costly and possibly dangerous evacuation. One of the latest applications of smart grid of greater interest in the U.S. is to give us increased resilience from storms. As all of you know, we were hit by Superstorm Sandy about 1 year ago. In fact, I was supposed to speak at the last year's Korea Smart Grid Week, and no airplanes were flying from the eastern United States, so I could not come, and I'm grateful to come this year and to be invited back. But you can see on this slide the trend in severe weather outages as computed by Munich Re, the large Swiss insurance company that tracks these outages. And you can see quite a significant upward trend from 1980 in the severe storms, hydrological and meteorological storms, that is, wind-based and flood-based storms. The red bars on that chart are earthquakes, and as you can see, and as you would expect, there is no trend line in earthquakes, but there is a trend in the other storms that we think is related to climate change. And this is starting to really affect ordinary citizens in the U.S., but also the power sector. There are many different ways the power sector is affected. The severe storms damage lines and flood power systems. But another impact of climate change is drought. And many parts of the U.S., including Texas, are suffering very deep droughts. What you see on the bottom of this slide, that picture, is the model from the power system operator in Texas, who has looked at the amount by which it must derate the generators in its system based on the severity of the drought. And as you can see, the duration is quite significant, 12,000 megawatts for even mild droughts. And the duration gets to be even larger when the droughts are more severe. And this has caused a level of concern that is very, very large in Texas, and it is prompting the state to look at demand response and other measures to improve the ability of the system to withstand these droughts. I should mention in talking about these severe storms that the response to Hurricane Sandy was unprecedented. The power industry worked very well and very hard to restore service, but more than 8 million people lost power, and in some areas, the entire customer base of a utility lost power for the first time ever in the history of those utilities. We are working now with the utility in New Jersey called Public Service Electric and Gas, and in response to this storm, it has already proposed a $3.2 billion investment program to harden its system, upgrade some facilities so that it is not as vulnerable to floods and high winds as it was when Sandy hit. So that's a very significant investment program. It has been brought to its regulators for approval. And there are lots of technical, economic, and policy issues related to these resilience investment programs that are quite new. The engineering trade-offs are new. That is, the choice of which system elements you choose to replace, upgrade, harden, bypass, make redundant. All of those engineering questions are difficult, but when you add in the economics of doing those and the value of greater reliability or greater resilience, you get extremely new and challenging questions and calculations that I have never seen done anywhere in the world before. It's a very exciting area of research for us at Brattle Group. Now, I mentioned microgrids. Microgrids are a hot topic in the U.S. right now. It's really, I think, Hurricane Sandy that prompted the interest in microgrids, or I should say elevated the interest in microgrids, because while 8 million people were without power, there were a few places along the coast of the eastern United States where Sandy hit that had electricity, and no one else had electricity. And those places were the few locations where there were microgrids that had been installed, in some cases, 5 or 10 or 20 years ago, just as demonstration projects or because there was a particularly far-seeing management of a hospital or a college. One of the microgrids was at the Food and Drug Administration, which is our regulator of pharmaceuticals. They have a research facility in Maryland, right near Washington, D.C., and it had a natural gas turbine and a diesel generator and all of the management, power management and grid management software it needed to function without the power grid. And it's surrounded by people living in the suburbs around it who did not have power, and as they would drive by and see this campus with power, it made quite a stir. The same thing happened in New York, where everyone had outages in power except for a few universities and other campuses in the New York area. In response to this, the governors of New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey in particular have all announced acceleration of microgrid construction. The governor of Connecticut pushed through a new law that that gives an automatic approval for a microgrid less than 5 megawatts. Prior to this, you needed to get very specific approvals from the local utility. He's also announced an $18 million investment in 9 new microgrids that have already been located. They haven't been built, but they know they're going to be at police stations and some universities in Connecticut, and has an additional $30 million fund. In New Jersey, the governor has announced the first microgrid, which will help the municipal transit system in Newark, New Jersey, to function even without grid services. It will be able to function even if the grid goes down. And in New York, the governor has also announced a microgrid initiative that is taking shape on Long Island in particular, but all across the state there is going to be activity in this area. There's also a $250 million DOE fund. Let's see what, let me just skip over that factor and try to summarize some of the future thoughts about the United States looking forward. As I mentioned, I think it's very unlikely that we will get large additional federal spending on smart grid. I'm sure you are seeing the news of controversy in the U.S. over our budget and our debt ceiling. The news I saw this morning is very positive in reaching agreement, but there is much pressure to limit federal spending. So now federal spending has gone from a level of billions of dollars down to hundreds of millions, roughly 200 million in smart grid. As I mentioned, the North American market has slowed down, particularly for smart meter installation. It hasn't stopped. And much of the growth is coming from China and EU. There was a lot of resistance initially in the regulators, not the federal government itself, but we have separate regulatory agencies against the smart grid. And there was also some customer opposition because people were fearful that smart meters would allow the government or their power company to spy on them, to lose their privacy. There is still some of this opposition. It is starting to fade away, and regulators are more comfortable with smart grid, but they are also very concerned about rates, and I think generally are going slow and careful with respect to smart meter investment approvals. As I mentioned, the infrastructure is coming along finally, and in particular dynamic pricing, which is very important to realize some of the benefits of smart meters, is coming along, and resilience concerns are coming up. So overall, I would say the U.S. is a mixed picture. It is by no means a negative picture. There is much progress and much movement. But the smart grid is, as I said at the beginning of this, integral to everything else happening in the U.S. power industry. And the everything else happening in the U.S. has a lot of turmoil and financial uncertainty associated with it. As we look at the controversy over the financial situation of the industry and so on. Nonetheless, I think smart grid investment will continue. I am certain it will continue in the U.S. at a modest pace. It is continuing now. And I think the smart grid is as much a part of today's power industry as electric generators or copper wire is. It is part and parcel of the industry. You cannot take it away from the industry. And as the industry evolves towards a cleaner, lower carbon industry, as it must, smart grid will be part of that evolution without any question in the U.S. and around the world. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I would be happy to answer some questions if there are any. But I thank you for your attention. I look forward to seeing you at the rest of this conference, and if you are in the United States, to seeing you there. Thank you.
Hello. Judy Anderson from Smart Grid Australia. Interested in your observations about microgrids in the US, and what is driving it is that the governors are wanting to set up microgrids around critical buildings or critical areas so that they do have some resilience. Is that what their focus is on, or is it they think it is the way of the future and they want to actually really kick the tires on this kind of technology?
Excellent question, Judy. The answer is both. They wonder if they don't know how broadly microgrids can evolve to become the dominant, how would you call it, architecture of the industry. I have predicted that someday the industry structure will be what I call a constellation of microgrids, linked microgrids. And they have read that and talked to me about it. But once I look at the realities of creating them, the logical place to start, because it's cheaper and also because these are facilities that you want to have resilience, are in public safety facilities and also campuses, universities and research facilities, even commercial campuses where it's easier to put in the infrastructure. And I think they are just realizing that to do a microgrid in a residential community would be quite invasive. You'd have to reroute lots of lines and put in lots of new hardware, and it would cost a lot more than current electricity service. So while the end state may be much more common microgrids, I think it will be quite a long time, and they will evolve from the cheaper places and the more logical places to put them.
Thank you. John Nunley from the Sunspec Alliance. Of course, net energy metering is very important to the solar industry, so I'm very interested in hearing you expound on that further.
Net metering is one of the 2 or 3 most controversial issues in the U.S. today. The largest number of well, let me back up and say net metering, just to review, means that if you are paying 10 cents a kilowatt hour to your local power company for power, which means 10 cents covers the generation and the transmission and the distribution of your power, the total cost of supplying you, that if you net metering means if you generate solar power at your home and you don't need the power and you send it back in the grid, the power company will pay you 10 cents a kilowatt hour for that power, the same price that you pay. That creates some economic challenges because the cost that the power grid avoids, the costs that it saves from the energy you give it, are only its wholesale energy costs. It does not save transmission and distribution expenses, so that its finances deteriorate when it pays as much for solar power as you pay for retail prices, unless it happens that the value of that solar energy equals or sometimes exceeds your retail price. And it is possible in the middle of the day in a constrained system that the value of that solar energy is more than 10 cents in this example. So The controversy is between the solar industry, which says that the value of solar power is often more than the retail rate, so that solar is being underpaid, and the power industry that says the value of that solar energy is less than 10 cents a kilowatt hour, so they are paying too much for solar energy. And the rest of because that customer who is selling solar power back to the grid is not paying their fair share, their total costs, the rest of the customers in the utility will have to pay more to cover the cost of the utilities. One of the reasons this controversy has risen is that the state of California has by far the largest number of customers who have solar power on their roofs and sell their power back to the utility at the same price they pay. Net energy metering. I think it's 80,000 customers. And the California state regulators did a study of how much of the cost of the utility system for Pacific Gas and Electric was not paid by all of the customers who were going to do this net energy metering, I think by 2020. I'm not sure of the final date. But the cost was more than $1 billion, $1.1 billion. And that was a very large amount of money to ask the customers who do not have solar panels on their roof to pay to offset the costs of those who do have it. Although there is much debate over this, there is also starting to be the outlines of, I think, an agreement. And the agreement will be something like we will do much more careful analysis of the value of that solar energy by the time of day that it is created and pay that to the solar panels, to the solar producers, rather than base the payment to them on the retail price they are paying. That's the latest idea that is emerging in the discussion, something along those lines. And in addition, something that I have been advocating is to take the transmission and distribution payment and disaggregate it or divide it into many specific smaller products. Energy backup power, voltage regulation, grid management services, that is, for your home. And we did this for wholesale transmission service in the 1990s very successfully and created markets for each of those services. And we now charge transmission users different transmission rates depending on what services they use. I think we need to move that idea down all the way to the household level. But I think it's a complex idea, and it will take several years to do the analysis that allows that to those rates to be changed in that way. We're just starting to do those analyses at the Brattle Group.